You've probably heard it a million times before. The war in Gaza has a 1-to-1 civilian to combatant ratio, and the UN average is 9-to-1.
Do you know what the UN states as the civilian to combatant death ratio for modern urban war? 9-to-1. That means 90% of people? Absolutely not. But look at what the numbers are. Even if you take Hamas's estimates, we're at about 1.4-to-1, and that's if you take Hamas's estimates. Meaning we are completely in every metric doing a better job of protecting innocent people than any other modern urban war in the history of the world.
Now, the UN statistics put the civilian to combatant ratio on general armed conflict at a very disturbing 9 civilians to every 1 combatant. The casualty figures in this war, in the context of intense urban armed conflict, are unprecedented at around 1-to-1.
If those figures are correct, and let's assume for a moment they are, particularly I don't trust the Hamas figures, but let's assume they're correct. That means that it's approximately 1 civilian killed for every combatant killed inside Gaza in the last 20 months.
The Israeli government has gone through such extraordinary efforts not to kill civilians that it has managed the best civilian to terrorist kill ratio in the history of urban warfare, and it is not close.
The war in Gaza has one of the lowest ratios of combatants to non-combatants casualties in the history of urban warfare.
Well, in this video, the first of a new series of videos I am making debunking what I call international Hasbara law, I'm going to rely on actual international law to show you why this claim is BS. The claim that Israel is fighting in Gaza with a 1-to-1 ratio was originally made, at least to my knowledge, by John Spencer, professor of urban warfare at West Point. He wrote an article in Newsweek on 25 March 2024 entitled, "Israel has created a new standard for urban warfare. Why will no one admit it?" There, he raved about the, quote, unique precautions taken by Israel as it launched its assault on Al-Shifa hospital. Thus, he said, "In my long career studying and advising on urban warfare for the US military, I've never known an army to take such measures to attend to the enemy's civilian population, especially while simultaneously combating the enemy in the very same buildings. In fact, by my analysis, Israel has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history, above and beyond what international law requires and more than the US did in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan." End quote. Spencer came up with this ratio theory in order to supposedly show the humanitarian effects of these measures. Spencer starts by noting the Gaza Ministry of Health death toll numbers, at the time 31,000 people killed, and subtracts from it the estimated 13,000 Hamas operatives the IDF claimed to have killed. This, he concludes, means that only 18,000 civilians had been killed, meaning that 1.5 civilians had been killed per each Hamas operative. Spencer, however, decides that since the Hamas figures are likely inflated, then this means that the ratio could be closer to 1-to-1. Now look, I'm no statistician, and I don't intend to rely on numbers in this video. Like, believe me, I need a calculator to split a normal restaurant bill. But even I know that you can't just grab the ministry's numbers and then just subtract the numbers from another dataset, especially when that dataset is not even public. Like literally, we know the names of every single person in the Gaza Ministry of Health record. Israel's estimate is instead just a number. We don't know where it comes from. What we do know, because Israeli soldiers have said so, is that many of these people were killed because they entered invisible, quote, kill zones in Gaza, where everyone inside is considered Hamas, including Israeli hostages waving white flags and yelling for help in Hebrew. So, to properly understand this claim about Hamas operatives, you need to first understand the manifest difference that exists between Israeli discourse and Israeli practice when it comes to targeting standards. Under international humanitarian law, states engaged in armed conflict are obligated to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Humanitarian standards, like those advanced by the ICRC, operationalize this by distinguishing individuals with a, quote, continuous combat function in an armed force from those who are simply members of the group. In other words, for instance, a Lebanese MP who militates in Hezbollah is not automatically a target for being a member of Hezbollah. This is why the pager attacks were illegal, but let's not get into that right now. Only members of an armed wing are targetable. Israel, however, has never accepted this standard, and the standard it claims to employ is interpreted through such a broad reading and violations are handled with such impunity that it is in practice non-existent. For instance, in 2009, the Israeli government released a report on the law applicable to so-called Operation Cast Lead, one of its many mowing the lawn operations, leading to hundreds of Palestinian deaths. In this report, Israel argued in line with international standards that, quote, it is unlawful to deliberately make civilians the object of attack. In other words, only those, quote, directly participating in hostilities are subject to attack. Israel defined direct participation as follows, quote, direct participation in hostilities has been interpreted by Israel's High Court of Justice as involving all persons that perform the function of combatants, including a civilian bearing arms openly or concealed who is on his way to the place where he will use them against the army, at such place or on his way back from it, as well as a person who collected intelligence on the army, whether on issues regarding the hostilities or beyond those issues, a person who transports unlawful combatants or to or from the place where the hostilities are taking place, a person who operates weapons which unlawful combatants use or supervises their operation or provides service to them, be the distance from the battlefield as it may. But just a few years later, in 2018 and 2019, Israel responded to mostly peaceful demonstrations during the Great March of Return with disproportionate and deadly force, in contravention of this supposed policy. Israel argued that its rules of engagement permit firing towards the legs of a key rioter or a key insider, but only as a last resort. As the UN Commission of Inquiry for Palestine said at the time, quote, the Israeli government does not in fact argue that the targeted key rioter is directly posing an imminent threat to a person. Rather, the argument is that shooting a key rioter, part of a threatening crowd, will cause the rest of the crowd to withdraw. This is of course unlawful, and the reason why Israel killed 189 protesters and wounded over 6,000 with live ammunition fire. In one instance reported by the Commission, a 16-year-old boy attached a rope to the barbed wire surrounding Gaza. Israeli soldiers shot at him, and he escaped, hiding behind a nearby barrier. While hiding, that is, while not being a threat, he was shot in the chest by a sniper. The boy was not a member of any armed group. In fact, the Commission found that only 29 of those killed had an affiliation to an armed group. This is not to say that they had a continuous combat function and therefore were targets. No, they had any kind of affiliation, including mere political affiliation. The Commission listed dozens of examples of Palestinian civilian men, women, and children being shot by Israeli forces in contravention of their supposed policy of distinguishing between combatants and civilians. According to the Commission, on May 14, 2018, the IDF announced that Hamas, quote, plans to send armed terrorists among 250,000 violent rioters to swarm and breach Israel's border with Gaza. Hamas plans to carry out a massacre in Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces will not let them, end quote. This thus presented a clear scenario in which to put in practice this policy of distinction between combatants and civilians. And yet, on that day, Israel killed 7 children. Wisal Khalil, age 14, Izzedin Samak, 13, Said Al-Kir, 15, Ahmad Al-Sha'ar, 15, Talal Matar, 16, Sadi Abu Salah, 16, and Ibrahim Al-Zarqa. 5 of them were shot to the chest or head by snipers. In other words, it would be disingenuous to take the IDF at its word when it tells Spencer it identified 13,000 combatants in Gaza by early 2024. This is simply not how the IDF identifies targets. If the IDF shot at over 6,000 people when dealing with demonstrators, imagine what it would do when taking revenge on October 7th. Just to give an example, on 25 June 2024, The Guardian published an article entitled The Grey Zone, How IDF Views Some Journalists in Gaza as Legitimate Targets. As the name suggests, the piece shows how Israel, despite specifically stating that, quote, there is no policy of targeting media personnel, routinely engages in practices that show otherwise. The Guardian found at least 23 journalists belonging to the Al-Aqsa network killed by Israel. Al-Aqsa is the Hamas official news channel. When asked about this number, a senior IDF spokesperson told The Guardian that there was no difference between working for the media outlet and belonging to Hamas's armed wing. The Guardian article continues by quoting a person with knowledge of legal advice given to the IDF commanders, noting that Al-Aqsa journalists were, quote, seen to exist within a gray zone, and that there was a problematic view among some in the IDF that whenever there was someone getting a salary, ultimately from Hamas, they were considered to be a legitimate target. Specifically, the article quotes an Israeli intelligence officer saying, quote, Hamas invests a lot of resources in its propaganda teams. They often won't do an activity if they don't have a photographer. They must document everything. So some will tell you, look, a Hamasnik is a Hamasnik. The IDF issued a statement in response to this article saying the spokesperson's words about not distinguishing between Al-Aqsa and Hamas's military wing was an error on his part that did not reflect IDF policies. But when The Guardian pushed for evidence that the killed journalists were actually part of Hamas's military wing, the IDF refused to offer any. According to reports, many of these killed journalists were killed in their homes while sleeping next to their spouses and children. And we know from other reports that many of these home strikes were decided by a poorly vetted AI software called Where's Daddy, which trafficked these presumed Hamas operatives and authorized strikes once they were home. It is highly likely, therefore, that Israel was not indeed distinguishing between these journalists and Hamas's military wing. This is not an isolated event. In April 2025, the NGO Breaking the Silence, made up of IDF veterans, published a report featuring interviews with soldiers who served in the Gaza perimeter buffer zone, frequently described as a kill zone. Their findings are chilling. For instance, asked about what precautions were taken for civilians, a warrant officer staged in northern Gaza said, quote, "There is no civilian population. They're terrorists, all of them." He reported how his commanding officers told him, "We go in, and if we identify suspects, we shoot them. We want them to learn they are not allowed to come out." Another warrant officer in Beit Hanun said, quote, "The IDF really is fulfilling the public's wishes, which states there are no innocents in Gaza. We'll show them," end quote. As they reported it, people were incriminated, that is, labeled a target for the military, for having bags in their hands. Guy showed up with a bag, he said, incriminated, terrorist. Similarly, a first-class sergeant in Khan Yunis described the operation as one of revenge. Quote, "The top goal, that was always stated, is to create a sense of security for the future residents of Nir Oz who will return." Nir Oz is an Israeli kibbutz that was attacked on October 7th. "The village that massacred you, we massacred it back." Situations like this, where Israel talks the talk but does not walk the walk, abound. The IDF is an army with targeting standards designed to deliberately obfuscate the difference between combatant and civilian. And this is just a small sample. I have not even discussed the sniping of Palestinians carrying white flags, the execution of humanitarian workers, the targeting of ambulances, the torture of detainees, the deliberate starvation of civilian populations, etc., etc., etc. All of these practices make Israel's claim that it carefully vetted and killed 13,000 Hamas members with a continuous combat function extremely unbelievable. In other words, not only is Spencer's trick here bad maths, it is also methodologically unsound, as it refuses to address Israel's deliberately deficient targeting practices. We simply cannot believe Israel when it says it killed 13,000 Hamas operatives, because many of those will likely have been journalists, humanitarian workers, or even civilians passing by that Israel is incriminating as operatives with no evidence, either because they entered a kill zone or because they were determined to be targetable Hamas members by a poor quality AI, or even out of pure spite by the soldiers and officers who want to massacre towns in revenge. It also refuses to acknowledge reality, clinging to the already debunked argument that the Gaza MOH's numbers are inflated. They are not. They are an undercount. People killed under the rubble are not registered here. Neither are indirect deaths. These are just the people that died in a hospital. The real number is estimated at more than double the current 60,000 names registered by the Ministry of Health. The ratio, therefore, is not 1-to-1. But this was not the only flimsy claim. In his Newsweek article, and many times more after that, Spencer claimed that the usual ratio in modern war is 1-to-9. That is, that 90% of casualties are civilians. This is an old, already debunked claim. In 2010, Adam Roberts, president of the British Academy and senior research fellow at the Centre for International Studies in Oxford University's Department of Politics and International Relations, published a peer review article in the academic journal Global Politics and Strategy, Volume 52, Issue 3. In other words, something quite a bit more academically robust than a Newsweek article. It was entitled "Lives and Statistics. Are 90% of war victims civilians?" In it, Roberts argued as follows, quote, "It has become a commonplace to say that war has changed radically since the early 20th century to the point where civilians now comprise some 80 or 90% of war victims. This proposition has been supported by many writers and academics, some United Nations agencies, and the European Union in its European security strategy. Yet it rests on shaky foundations. It is possible that in some particular conflicts, 9 out of 10 deaths are civilians, but the proposition does not hold up as a generalization about all war in the past 2 decades. There is persuasive evidence that certain wars have had civilian death tolls far lower than 90%. The proposition intended to alert the world to the importance of protecting civilians has probably had the unintended effect of reinforcing cynicism about efforts to limit the human cost of war." Roberts traced the claim that 90% of wartime victims were civilians to 2 potential culprits: the 1991 report on casualties of conflict prepared by the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, and Ruth Legger-Sivard's 1991 annual compilation on world military and social expenditures. The former, he says, often based its numbers on casualty estimates, and importantly, included uprooted persons as victims of war, which seriously inflated the numbers. If excluded, Roberts claims, the, again, estimated number would be closer to 60%. The latter was based on what Roberts describes as guesstimates, whose sources and methodology are, quote, far from clear. Importantly, Sievert's figures included victims of war-related famines, a data point for which no reliable information exists. Roberts then reports how these two faulty claims made the 90% number gain traction in the literature, without anyone really bothering to check, especially among UN reports. Very quickly, 90% victims of war became 90% of wartime fatalities. By 1999, the claim exploded into the mainstream when it was taken up by famous LSE professor Mary Kaldor in her landmark book, New and Old Wars. Ever since then, however, there's been a growing consensus among experts that this supposed 9-to-1 ratio is an urban myth of contemporary warfare. Spencer clearly fell for this myth, and in a particularly egregious way. See, Spencer did not cite to the Uppsala study or Sievert's figures or even Mary Kaldor's book, which would at least show that he'd done his homework. No, Spencer got his information from a press release. See, in May 2022, Ramesh Rajasingam, director at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, briefed the UN Security Council on UN document S 2022-381, a report by the UN Secretary General on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. During this briefing, he said, quote, conflict continued to cause widespread civilian deaths last year, notably in densely populated areas where civilians accounted for 90% of the casualties when explosive weapons were used, compared to 10% in other areas. That's it. That's where Spencer got his number. Not from the original report, but from the press release of the briefing about the report. How do I know he didn't get the number from the report itself? Well, because the report does not really make the claim that 90% of wartime casualties are civilians. That's literally just the flashy title that some comms person at the UN put in the title to the press release, relying on Rajasingam's rounded up figures. Instead, the report itself says that of 1,234 reported incidents involving the use of explosive weapons in populated areas in 2021 in 21 specific states affected by armed conflict, resulting in 10,184 victims, 89% of these were civilians. Let's be clear from the get-go. Not only did Spencer cite the wrong document, he also left out a whole lot of caveats there. His claim is that 90% of casualties in modern war are civilians. This is not the claim his source makes. His source says that 89% of victims of specific types of explosive attacks in 21 specific conflicts were civilians. This is important because the study is focused only on attacks that use high explosives, not any attack. This means that the number will be inflated. Spencer is only counting the most casualty-heavy instances and discarding, for example, attacks with assault rifles where no one died. This is serious enough, but it is not Spencer's most serious misrepresentation. See, the study he did not cite and clearly did not read also does not say that 90% of casualties in war are civilians. It says that 89% of victims are civilians. Spencer transformed a report that said that 89% of wounded and killed victims of attacks with high explosives in 2021 in 21 specific countries were civilians into a claim that 90% of casualties in all modern wars are civilians. And yet this claim that Israel has an extraordinarily low civilian to combatant ratio compared to the global average has been pushed and pushed and pushed by Spencer and other advocates of international Hasbara law as if it were some technical data point. It isn't. It's frankly fake news. Israel's ratio is not 1-to-1. According to the specialized think tank Action on Armed Violence, it is actually likely 10-to-1. Likewise, the world average is not 9-to-1. It is likely half of that, or even less. In any case, as Roberts concluded back in 2010, quote, the entire exercise of seeking universal civilian military casualty ratios is flawed. To build up a more accurate picture, there is a need to focus on actual wars, to recognize achievements in protecting civilians, and to criticize violations. To call for more systematic recording on casualties, to support high standards of rigor and professionalism in this work, and to address the admittedly difficult question of whether parties involved in armed conflict are now or should in the future be under an obligation to report on numbers and possibly even names of civilian casualties, or whether the task should be left to independent bodies. As a reminder, Israel does not count how many civilians it's killed in Gaza, and it willfully seeks to discredit the one entity that does, the Gaza MOH, despite ample evidence that their work is reliable. So there, the so-called 1-to-1 ratio is bad Hasbara. Do not fall for it. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a similar analysis of other international Hasbara law claims, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.